Good morning. It's good to see you all this morning. It's good to be with all of you this morning. I'm excited in some ways to do this lesson because this is, I think, probably one of my favorite lessons to teach. It's one of my favorite lessons to teach because I think it's probably one of the ones that's taught me the most and probably one of the ones that's made the biggest impact on my life. And not to say it's the only lesson that's ever made an impact on my life, but probably one of the biggest ones. And it may not have as big of an impact upon you, but in case it does, I'd like to share. So what I'd like to talk about today is how do we become what we want to become? How do we become what we want to become? And that should be an important question to us because we should have an idea of who we want to become. We want to be people who are pleasing to God. So we should have a goal in mind. I want to be someone pleasing to God. Well, how do we accomplish that? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. Now, what I'm not going to do is I don't have time to or the resources to. I'm not going to go into all the specifics because there are a lot of things that we can talk about. It's like, well, what's pleasing to God? Well, there are a lot of things that are pleasing to God. There are a lot of things that are not pleasing to God. So if we try to get into the do's and don'ts, we're going to be here a really long time. So that's not how we're going to approach this lesson. The way we're going to approach this lesson is what approach to life is a life or approach that is pleasing to God. That's what I'm going to look at this morning, is what type of lifestyle pleases God. And the way I want to look at this is I want to look basically at three people in the Bible and how they approached life and see if those approaches were or weren't pleasing to God, and therefore we should or shouldn't follow that approach. And hopefully what I've done is, at least is what I've tried to do, is I've tried to pick three approaches I think are pretty common approaches to life. Things that we see in the world all around us, or maybe things that we see in ourselves. And I'm hoping, again, that we can learn some things from this. So, the first person I'd like to talk about is Solomon. And I'd like you all to turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. We're going to be reading a few verses from Ecclesiastes 1 and Ecclesiastes 2. And in Ecclesiastes, Solomon is really, especially these early chapters, and he does throughout the whole thing, but he really talks about his approach to life and things that he tries, his goals, his mindset. And I'd like to see what we can get from that. So in Ecclesiastes 1, look at verse 13. Verse 13 says, "And I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under earth." I think here what Solomon is saying when he says wisdom is, I think probably in this context he's talking about the idea of knowledge. So Solomon's looking for knowledge. All right, well, how does that work out? Look down at verse 17. "And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, and I perceive this is also but a striving after wind." All right, well, that's not where it's at. So now look at the beginning of chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 1. "So I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself." All right, so it wasn't in just gaining knowledge. Maybe it will be in pleasure. Look down at verse 9. "So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this is my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind. There was nothing to gain under the sun." So it's not to be found in pleasure. But he continues. Look at verse 12. "So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly." All right, we've already had that phrase, wisdom and madness and folly. I think here, because of what he's going to say in a second, I think here he's talking not just about gaining knowledge, but the idea of the earthly application of knowledge, that kind of wisdom. So prudent living. But look at what he says in verse 15. So maybe it's in living wisely. "Then I said to my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? Then I said in my heart that this also is vanity." So not there. Finally, let's look at verse 22. "What has a man from all the toil and striving of heart?" So he's talking here about work. "With which he toils beneath the sun. For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity." So what we see Solomon doing here is, at this point in his life is he's jumping from goal to goal to goal. So he's like, well, maybe my purpose in life is in knowledge. Maybe it's in pleasure. Maybe it's in my work. And what does he find over and over and over again? It's vanity. Well, what is Solomon doing here? I think, specifically, obviously, he's pursuing these different things. But I think there's maybe a more general way we can describe what he's doing here. And I'm going to try to use a phrase that hopefully we know what it means. I think what Solomon's trying to do is he's trying to find himself. And so what he's doing is he's, like I said, he's jumping from knowledge to pleasure to work. He's trying to find himself. Maybe this is my meaning in life. Now, do we see people do the same thing today? Absolutely we do. I mean, we see people all the time say, I'm trying to find myself. And I think maybe oftentimes we think about a very specific age. We think about the age where you kind of get out from underneath your parents, those college age years. And we think about people trying to find themselves in those years, trying to find their meaning in life and what they want to do. But it's not just limited to those ages. There is a thing called a midlife crisis. What happens in a midlife crisis? Someone gets, to maybe not a specific age, but at a certain point in their life, and they say, what have I been doing? Like, where am I going to find meaning in life? And then you see a lot of times expensive cars be bought and things like that, but maybe bad choices. My point is that this is an approach to life that many people take. Many people take the approach to life of saying, I'm going to find myself. So, does this lead to a successful life? And remember, what we're asking when we're saying successful life is we're not just asking like, do they have a lot of money? Do they have a lot of friends? A successful life is a life that's pleasing to God. That's our goal, is to be someone who's pleasing to God. If success was defined by money or friends, I think Solomon had that pretty much down. He had lots of money. He had a lot of alliances. But does it lead to success in pleasing God? And the answer is no. And Solomon may not have had a lot right in this point in his life. But at least he was able to, every time he took one of these approaches, say, this is vanity. This is vanity. This is vanity. He at least had the wisdom to see that. This is not going to lead us to pleasing God. And I'd like to say this. When you live to find yourself, what you end up doing is you end up living for yourself. And that's not the kind of life that's going to be pleasing to God. So, this is not a way of life that we should pursue. It's very common. But it's not going to be one that's going to get us where we want to go. Now, the second person I'd like to look at is Joash. So if you would, please turn to 2 Kings. Actually, don't turn to 2 Kings. Turn to 2 Chronicles. That's the one I really want to focus on. So turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 24. I will read from 2 Kings 12, but I really want us to look at 2 Chronicles 24. So, King Joash, he was a king, but he was a king that survived in infancy, even though his grandmother, Athaliah, tried to kill him. She was trying to kill all the heirs. He survives. And the reason he survives is because of Jehoiada's wife. She saves him. Now, Jehoiada is a priest, and Jehoiada and his wife take him in, and they raise him. And when Joash becomes 7 years old, Jehoiada helps him become king, helps overthrow Athaliah, and he's going to be king now. And what I want us to look at is I want us to look at a couple of passages here that are going to give us an idea of the kind of reign that Joash had and the kind of approach he took to life. And again, I think we can learn something from this. So I am going to start in 2 Kings passage, but I'll get to 2 Chronicles in a second. So 2 Kings chapter 12, it says, in the 7th year of Jehu, Jehoash, another name for Joash, began to reign. He reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba. And Jehoash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all his days, because Jehoiada the priest instructed him. Now, that phrase may not seem like much. We may look at that and say, well, it sounds pretty good, right? Joash, sounds pretty good. He's doing what's right in the eyes of the Lord. But there's that little phrase tacked on the end, right? Because Jehoiada the priest instructed him. And again, maybe that doesn't seem like a lot because, like, well, Jehoiada's the one that raised him, so of course he's going to have influence on his life. Yes. It's when we get to 2 Chronicles, I think we see why that was mentioned. So let's look at 2 Chronicles now. So 2 Chronicles 24, verse 2. And Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Again, does that sound good so far? Absolutely. But it doesn't end there. It says, all the days of Jehoiada the priest. And we may look at that and say, well, that's a weird thing to say, right? He did what was right all the days of Jehoiada the priest. And I think that probably begs a question, right? The question is, what happens after the days of Jehoiada the priest? Well, we'll get to that in a second. I do want to mention this. When it says he does what's right in the eyes of the Lord, this is true. He tries to bring the people's hearts to the Lord. In fact, one of the things we see he does, probably one of his major accomplishments, is that he restores the house of the Lord. All right, and that's going to be important here in a second. But he restores the house of the Lord. Now let's look down at verse 17. It says, now after the death of Jehoiada, okay, we're about to get into that, all the days of Jehoiada the priest, we're about to get to after that, right? So after the death of Jehoiada, the princes of Judah came and paid homage to the king. Then the king listened to them. Okay. So before, he was listening to Jehoiada. Jehoiada instructed him. And how did that look? Looked pretty good, right? Looked pretty good. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Now these princes come along, and he listens to them. Well, what's that going to look like? Let's look at verse 18. And they abandoned the house of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and served the Asherim and the idols. What it looks like is disobeying God. What it looks like is undoing the good he had done before. Before he had restored the house of the Lord, now he's abandoning the house of the Lord. Before he had served God and done what was right in the eyes of the Lord, now he's serving idols. And God doesn't give up on him. We see that God sends prophets, but he doesn't listen. And eventually God sends one named Zechariah. And Zechariah is Jehoiada's son. And you would think in this situation, well, at least I assume, they had some type of relationship. I don't know if he viewed him as a brother or just, some type of relative, but you would assume there's some type of relationship there. And even if there isn't, it's Jehoiada's son. The man who raised you, it's his son. You think you have respect for him. So Zechariah goes and tries to bring Joash back. You know what Joash does? He has him killed. The man who raised him, he has his son killed because he rebukes him and tries to bring him back to God. So I think the question is, how did we get here? What is Joash doing? Well, I think it has all to do with the approach he took to life. And again, I'd like to use a phrase I hope we're familiar with. I think what Joash is doing here, and I don't want to make too little of what he's doing here because what he's doing is horrific, but he's going with the flow. What he's doing is he's looking at the people around him and saying, all right, what are we doing, guys? And then he falls in line. He lets the people around him decide what he's going to do and who he's going to be. Now, do we still see this today? Absolutely. Again, I would say, maybe I'm wrong on this, I don't have statistics, but I would guess that this is probably one of the most common approaches to life. I would guess that most people in their lives look at the people around them and say, what are we doing? And then they do the same thing. They go with the flow. They let others determine how they're going to live. Now, let's come back to Joash for a second. I mentioned this, but I'm going to mention it again. Can this look good? Yes, it can. When Jehoiada was the main influence in Joash's life, it looked really good. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He was restoring the house of the Lord. It looked good. But it can also look horrific. And that's what we see with Joash as well. So when he had different people influencing him, when those princes come in, he was a completely different person. He abandoned the house of the Lord, killed his messengers. that can be true with us too. I think that we may see a lot of people in our lives, and they do the right things. They attend services, they keep God's commandments, they look like they're doing right. And they're doing it because their parents, their spouse, their friends, their family, children expect them to. They're not doing it because of their own motivation, they're doing it because someone else expects them to do that. We need to understand that this will not lead to pleasing God. Just because we do good things doesn't mean we're going to be pleasing to God. And in fact, if we take this approach to life, of letting others determine how we live, not only will it not lead to pleasing God, it could just as easily lead to full rebellion to God, as we see with Joash. I said with the previous one with Solomon, when you live to find yourself, you live for yourself. I think what we see in this approach to life is that when you live to go with the flow, you live for others. And this, again, cannot be pleasing to God. So, this should not be a way of life that we're going to pursue. All right. Let's talk about our last person here. So the last one I'd like to talk about is Paul. And if you would, please turn to Acts chapter 26. Acts chapter 26. We're going to talk about Paul. In this passage, in Acts 26, he's talking to King Agrippa. And what he's doing here is he's telling his conversion story. And I think there are a couple of interesting, I guess there are a lot of interesting things he says, but there are a couple I want to point out that are maybe particularly interesting for what I'm going to talk about here. We're going to pick up in verse 9. So Acts 26, verse 9. Paul says, and at this point he would have been considered Saul, but Paul's saying this, and he says, I myself was convinced that I ought to do many things in opposing the name of Jesus of Nazareth. That's not good. So what does he do? He says, I did so in Jerusalem. I not only locked up many of the saints in prison after receiving authority from the chief priest, but when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. And I punished them often in all the synagogues and tried to make them blaspheme. And in raging fury against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. So Paul's talking about, what he was doing before. And what he was doing before is not looking good. What he was doing is opposing the name of Jesus. He was opposing God's will, persecuting Christians, having Christians killed. It's not good. But notice what he said at the very beginning of that verse 9. He says, I was convinced that I ought to do these things. Well, that's interesting. We're going to come back to that. He was convinced he ought to do these things. Then what he does is he continues his story. He talks about on his way to Damascus, how Jesus came to him, rebuked him, called him to repent and to follow him. And then look down at verse 19. Because I think the question would be like, how's he going to respond to that? Because if anybody knew what that meant, it would be Paul, right? He would understand this is going to be a life that's not going to be easy. It's going to be a life where people are going to be hunting you. And he would know that because he was the hunter. And look at what he says in verse 19. Therefore, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. So you see, he's living a certain life. And then he's called to do something different, something hard, and yet he doesn't. And we may say, well, what is Paul doing here? And I think we may even say or think in our minds, is this kind of like what's going on with Joash? Joash started off one way, ends up a different way, goes a completely different direction. And, Paul, same kind of thing, just opposite direction, right? He starts off not good, and then he goes to good. So is he doing the same thing as Joash? Does he have the same approach to life as Joash? And I would say no. And I think the difference is that Joash did not know who he was. And so he let others decide for him. I think what happened with Paul is I think Paul knew exactly who he was. Paul had chosen to be a follower of God. He had decided, I'm going to follow God. And at first, he was convinced that what that meant was to oppose the name of Jesus. He was convinced that was God's will. Now, he was wrong. And when he found out he was wrong, guess what? He changed. Because what he was a follower of God. And whenever he figures out that this is not what God would want, that's not what he's going to do anymore. And he changes. Paul's approach to life. And I really want us to listen to this because this is maybe the main point of the lesson today. Paul's approach to life was deciding he was going to be a follower of God and then pursuing it with everything he had. And no matter what it meant. And that decision decided and drove every other decision in his life. Now, we should ask the same question we've been asking for the other. Does this lead to a successful life? And again, remember, we're talking about successful here. We're not talking about does it lead to wealth or does it lead to popularity or power. We're asking, does it please God? And the answer is yes. Paul may not have had those other things. He may not have had wealth or popularity or power. But he did please God. So, this is an approach to life that we should take as well. We need to decide that we're going to be servants of God and then pursue it with everything we have, no matter what. Now, this is something that we don't just see with Saul, or I keep saying Saul, with Paul. This is not something we just see with Paul. This is all throughout the Bible. So, I would like you to turn to Deuteronomy chapter 30. So, Landon read for us in the Bible reading this morning, Deuteronomy chapter 30. And we're going to read through the two verses that he read this morning, but probably at different times. We're going to read verse 19 right now. In Deuteronomy 30, what you have is you have Moses, and he's about to send the people, the Israelites, into the land of Canaan. And he's basically, throughout the book of Deuteronomy, gone through their history, gone through what God's done for them, through what that's called them to do. And he's kind of at the end of it and trying to, really emphasize some certain things here at the end. And look at what he says. We've already read it, but I want us to look at it again. So Deuteronomy 30, verse 19. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, choose life, that you and your offspring may live. So this idea of deciding who we're going to be, choosing who we're going to be, is there when Moses is trying to get the Israelites to be who they're supposed to be. He says, you have to choose to be servants of God. You have to choose to do right. And then, you don't want to turn here, but in Joshua 24, this is one that's pretty well known to us. Joshua is talking to the people of Israel. He says, if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so what does Joshua say here? He says, you've got to make a choice. Decide who you're going to be. You're either going to be servants of God or you're going to be servants of idols. I've made a choice, and I'm going to be a servant of God. And this is something that's not limited to the Old Testament. I think we see it, again, throughout the New Testament. But particularly, I want to point out, maybe it's not super clear, but hopefully I'll be able to make my point. I think we see it even the very first message given in the New Testament. The first message we have given in the New Testament is repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Well, what's the idea of repenting? The idea of repenting is saying, I've done bad things, and I'm going to choose to do better. I'm going to choose to put those things away, and I'm going to choose to follow God. So I think really the very first message we get is make a choice. Choose to follow God. And there are many, many other things that we could look at, many other passages we could look at. But I think what's clear is that the Bible emphasizes that the key to being successful, the key to pleasing God, is deciding who you are and then pursuing it with everything you've got. It's not finding yourself, and it's not going with the flow. You have to decide who you're going to be. Now, I want to come back to the idea we had at the beginning. At the beginning, we talked about it's important to know how to become who we want to become. And the reason it's important is because we have, or we should, have a goal in mind. We want to be people pleasing to God. Here's what I'm going to say about that. I think many times it is very easy for us to have goals just in general in life. Like, I want to be that kind of person. I want to be in that kind of situation. And what we see all throughout life is unless you've decided that's who you're going to be and that's what you're going to do, and there's no straying from that, you don't accomplish those things. And that's true with this as well. And with those other things, it may or may not be important that you actually accomplish your goal. But this is very important that you accomplish your goal. So understanding that whenever you make this choice, that you need to view this as who you are is very important. Okay? It's not just, this is part of who I am, or this is something that I do. This is who you are. I am a servant of God. I am a follower of God. That's not something I do. I don't just follow a list of rules. It's who I am. If we don't view it like that, then we won't be successful. We know the passage, or at least I think it's a pretty well-known passage. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Well, what's the idea of that? The idea is that I am a new person. Christ is deciding my actions, not myself. Right? It's not part of me. It is who I am. Now, what does this look like in our lives? Hopefully you're still at Deuteronomy 30. I think in Deuteronomy 30, Moses gives us a pretty good idea of what it looks like to choose to be a servant of God. We read verse 19 where he says, therefore choose life. In verse 20, I think he gives us a pretty good idea of what that's supposed to look like in our lives. Verse 20, he says, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice, and holding fast to him, for he is your life in length of days. I think this is what it looks like to choose to be a servant of God and viewing yourself only as that. I think it looks like loving the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. I think it looks like obeying his voice. You know, we've been talking about, it's not just rules, but there are rules involved. And then I like that last phrase, holding fast to him. And I love that phrase because the idea there is you're clinging to God. And you don't want to let go. And you say, I need you. This is what it looks like to choose to be God's servant. This is how we have to view it. So, here's the question for you this morning as we wrap up. Are you a follower of God? And what I'm not asking is, I'm not asking, have you been baptized? That is important. That's necessary, but that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, is that who you are? Is that who you are? Do you view yourself that way? Is serving God the driving force of your life? Not just a part of who you are. Is that you? If not, then you, like we said before, will not be successful in pleasing God. So what I want to encourage everybody to do today is choose this day to serve the Lord. If we can help you with that, we would love to. Please come and ask for that help as we stand and sing together.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.